The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, and everything outside that tunnel felt unreal, as if the world had already decided to erase itself. The road appeared and vanished in fragments, slick with rain that had turned cold enough to sting, the asphalt reflecting light like black ice even where no ice should have formed yet. Evelyn drove with both hands locked on the steering wheel, shoulders rigid, breath shallow, her body already braced for something she could not name. The sense of being watched had settled into her hours ago, not as fear exactly, but as pressure, the way altitude pressed against lungs before the pain arrived. The GPS glowed on the cracked dashboard, confident in its instructions. A thin blue line insisted this was the fastest route. 15 minutes saved. A shortcut drawn by an algorithm that had never been here, had never smelled this air or felt how the road subtly sloped wrong beneath the tires. Evelyn had followed it anyway because she was tired of second-guessing everything, tired of turning back, tired of detours that led only to more waiting. She needed distance. She needed the city behind her to become a problem that belonged to someone else. Her daughter slept in the passenger seat, small body folded into the oversized jacket Evelyn had wrapped around her before leaving. 6 years old and already learning how to sleep through movement, through uncertainty. Evelyn glanced at her only briefly, checking the rise and fall of her chest, the soft line of her mouth, the faint shadow under her eyes that had not been there a month ago. In the back seat, a single duffel bag shifted with every curve in the road. Documents, birth certificates, cash sealed in plastic, clothes chosen for speed, not comfort, a life reduced to what could be carried without explanation. She had not left for freedom. She had left because staying had become louder than leaving. 2 phone calls in 3 days, both from numbers that vanished when she tried to trace them. No threats spoken aloud, only reminders dressed as concern. A name mentioned that should not have been remembered. An address referenced that should not have been known. Her husband's former business partner had resurfaced like a body dragged up by its own secrets, and Evelyn had understood immediately that debts were only an excuse. What he wanted was leverage. What he wanted was proximity. The radio crackled without warning, volume spiking for half a second before settling into a low hiss. Evelyn reached to turn it off, then stopped. Beneath the static, voices surfaced and disappeared, layered too closely together to be a single broadcast. Not music, not talk radio. Fragments of speech sliding over one another, slowed and warped as if recorded underwater. She killed the radio completely, and the silence that followed felt heavier than noise. Her phone vibrated once in the cup holder, then went dark. No signal, no emergency bars, just a black screen reflecting her own tense face back at her. She exhaled through her nose and focused on the road, but the beam of the headlights no longer revealed familiar shapes. The guardrail ended abruptly. The reflective markers grew sparse, then vanished altogether. Ahead, a single reflector flared bright white in the mist, suspended too high to belong to a post. For a moment it seemed to drift sideways, then disappeared as the road bent sharply left without warning. The tires slid slightly, just enough to send a spike of adrenaline through her spine. She corrected, heart hammering, and eased off the accelerator. The forest pressed closer on both sides now, dense stands of pine rising straight and dark, their branches heavy with moisture. The smell seeped into the car through the vents. Wet needles, cold soil, something metallic underneath, like rust carried on rain. It reminded her of the hours after a storm, when the air tasted charged and wrong. The engine coughed once. Evelyn felt it through the steering wheel before she heard it, a stutter in the rhythm that did not belong. She pressed the gas lightly. The response lagged, then came too strong. The dashboard lights flickered. She swallowed and scanned the road for a turnout, but the asphalt narrowed instead, shoulders crumbling into shadow. Another cough. This one sharper. She whispered a curse under her breath and coaxed the car forward, muscles tight, mind calculating distances she could not see. The engine died without drama. No explosion. No warning chime. Just a sudden absence, like a heartbeat stopping mid-beat. The headlights went out. The dashboard went dark. Momentum carried the car a few more yards before it rolled to a halt on a slight incline. Silence rushed in, thick and immediate. Evelyn sat very still, hands still gripping the wheel, listening. The forest did not respond the way it should have. There were no insects, no distant wind through branches, no reassuring background noise. Even the rain had faded to a fine mist that barely touched the hood. She reached for the hazard lights. Nothing. Tried the ignition again. The engine turned once, sluggish and heavy, then fell silent. She leaned forward, forehead almost touching the wheel, and closed her eyes for a second. Then she opened them and reached for the flashlight she kept in the door pocket. The beam cut a weak cone through the darkness outside, catching the edge of the road sign just beyond the hood. It leaned at an angle, half buried in wet earth, old. The reflective paint had cracked and peeled, but beneath newer layers of gray, older letters bled through. A town name partially scraped away, painted over, then scratched back into visibility by time and weather. She could not read it fully, but something about the shape of the letters tightened her chest. This place had been named once, then unnamed, then forgotten badly. Evelyn stepped out of the car, cold immediately biting through her jacket. The ground felt uneven beneath her boots, softer than it should have been, as if the road had been laid hastily over soil that still wanted to move. She walked a few steps ahead, sweeping the flashlight across the trees, looking for any sign of habitation, any break in the forest that suggested this road led somewhere real. That was when she heard it. The sound rose from the left, low and sustained, cutting cleanly through the quiet. Not the chaotic howl of an animal calling blindly into the night, but something controlled, measured, held at a steady pitch as if shaped deliberately. It carried distance without distortion, each note clear enough to count the seconds between breaths. Her body reacted before her thoughts did. Every hair on her arms lifted. Her pulse slowed instead of racing, a cold focus settling in that she recognized from moments when panic had nowhere to go. She turned slowly, flashlight beam trembling just enough to betray her. Between the trees, something moved. At first, it was only the suggestion of mass, a darker density where darkness already lived. Then the shape resolved. Tall shoulders, a broad chest, a head carried low and forward. A large animal, larger than it should have been, standing just inside the tree line where the road gave way to forest. The beam caught the edge of its outline, a glint of pale fur, then eyes. They did not reflect like an animal's eyes should have. There was no startled flare, no frantic darting. They held steady, fixed on her with a calm that felt like assessment rather than curiosity. The shape did not advance. It shifted its weight once, deliberately, and angled its head slightly, as if measuring distance or reading her posture. The howl did not repeat. The forest remained silent around it, as though everything else had agreed to stay out of this exchange. Evelyn's first instinct was to retreat to the car, to lock the doors and make herself small behind glass and steel. But the second instinct, quieter and more unsettling, told her that the car was no longer protection. It was a marker, a signal, something too easy to find. She glanced back over her shoulder, and that was when she saw the headlights. Far down the road behind her, a faint glow appeared and disappeared with the curve of the asphalt. Another vehicle, moving steadily, too steadily, not swerving, not slowing, just following the line she had taken into this dead stretch of nowhere. The animal in the trees did not react to the approaching lights. If anything, its attention sharpened, ears angling not toward the road, but toward Evelyn herself. Understanding arrived without logic. Staying put meant being found. Being found meant questions she could not answer and demands she could not refuse. Whatever waited in the forest was unknown, dangerous in ways she could not define, but it was not converging on her. It was waiting. Evelyn backed toward the passenger door, opened it carefully, and shook her daughter awake with a gentle urgency that kept her voice low and controlled. The child stirred, confused but quiet, eyes blinking in the dark. Evelyn wrapped her tighter in the jacket, lifted her, and slung the duffel over her shoulder in one practiced motion. She did not look back at the car again. The animal stepped backward into the trees, slow enough to remain visible, far enough to be an invitation rather than an approach. The forest behind it did not look like chaos. There were gaps between trunks, darker paths where undergrowth thinned, lines that suggested movement through this place was possible if one knew how. The headlights behind her grew brighter, closer now, beams sweeping across the road sign, the abandoned car, the empty stretch of asphalt where she had been standing seconds before. Evelyn tightened her grip on her daughter and stepped off the road, into the cold, damp earth, following the only presence that had not yet tried to claim her. The forest closed around them with a density that felt intentional, as if the road had been a skin they slipped out of rather than a boundary they crossed. Evelyn moved carefully, each step measured, her daughter's weight warm and unsteady against her chest. The flashlight beam cut through trunks and branches in a narrow, shaking cone, revealing not chaos but structure. The ground was uneven yet worn, compressed in places by repeated passage. Roots surfaced where they had been cleared of debris, stones arranged in low lines that guided the foot without announcing themselves. This was not wilderness in the pure sense. This was land that had been used and then allowed to pretend it had not been. She left the car deliberately visible behind them, a dark shape on the pale ribbon of road, keys still in the ignition, hazard triangle propped just enough to be seen. It felt wrong to abandon it so openly, but wrongness had shifted meanings tonight. The car was no longer an escape. It was a decoy, a loud promise that whoever followed would find something waiting that was not her. The animal appeared again without sound, slipping between the trees as if the forest parted for it. Up close, it was even larger than she had judged on the road. Its fur was thick and mottled with shades of gray and silver that caught the flashlight in dull flashes. Pale scars crossed its muzzle and shoulder, old injuries healed cleanly, the kind that came from survival rather than accident. Its eyes tracked her movements with unsettling precision, not wide or feral, but narrowed, focused, weighing distance and pace. It did not look at the child as prey. It looked at her as an equation. It never rushed her. When she slowed, it slowed. When she stopped to adjust her grip or quiet her daughter's restless shifting, it waited, body angled sideways, attention split between her and the dark behind them. Several times it moved ahead, disappearing briefly into shadow, only to reappear further along the faint trail, positioned exactly where the path would have become ambiguous. Each reappearance reinforced the same impression. This was not pursuit. This was guidance. The forest itself felt altered the deeper they went. The air grew stiller, insulated from the wind that had scraped across the road. The scent changed too, less sharp pine and wet soil, more wood smoke and something resinous beneath it. Evelyn noticed marks on trees, shallow cuts arranged too evenly to be animal damage. Stones placed upright at intervals, their surfaces worn smooth by hands rather than weather. Fallen branches stacked neatly at the base of trunks, not gathered for firewood, but removed from paths as if to keep them clear. Time stretched and compressed in ways she could not track. Her muscles burned, then numbed. Her thoughts thinned to simple priorities. Keep moving, keep the child warm, do not trip. The flashlight beam began to feel fragile, a single thread holding the world together. She expected exhaustion to bring panic, but instead it brought a strange calm, the acceptance that there was no turning back to a version of safety she recognized. The house appeared without ceremony. One moment the trees crowded close, their trunks overlapping in the beam. The next the ground opened into a shallow clearing, and there it stood, solid and undeniable. A wooden house, 2 stories at most, its lines clean and maintained, roof pitched steeply to shed snow. A covered veranda wrapped the front, its railings intact, boards swept clear of debris. A small generator sat to one side, partially shielded by a lean-to, its casing dry and recently wiped down. From the chimney rose a thin, steady thread of smoke, pale against the dark sky, proof of heat and recent use. There were no tire tracks in the clearing, no parked vehicles, no footprints she could see in the damp earth beyond her own. The wolf slowed, then stopped at the edge of the clearing, body half in shadow, half in the spill of the house's exterior light. It did not approach the porch. It did not signal further. It simply stood there, watchful, head lifted slightly, ears rotating as if listening for something beyond her perception. Evelyn hesitated only a moment before crossing the clearing. The porch boards creaked softly under her boots, a sound so ordinary it nearly undid her. She adjusted her daughter again, feeling the child's face press into her shoulder, breathing deep and even despite the unfamiliar surroundings. The front door was unlocked. Inside, warmth enveloped them immediately, dry and steady, the kind that came from a well-fed fire rather than a space heater. The smell of burning wood lingered in the air, mixed with soap and old paper. She shut the door behind her, sliding the bolt into place out of instinct more than strategy, then stood still in the entryway, listening. The house responded with silence that felt lived in rather than abandoned. Floorboards settled. The fire crackled somewhere deeper inside. No footsteps, no voices, no sign of recent disturbance. She moved cautiously, sweeping the flashlight across the interior. The main room opened wide, anchored by a stone fireplace with a fire burning low but steady. Furniture was sparse but solid. A long couch with thick blankets folded neatly along the back, a heavy wooden table scarred by use, shelves lined with books and practical objects rather than decoration. Everything had a place. Nothing looked staged. She laid her daughter on the couch, wrapping her in one of the blankets, watching until her breathing evened out again. Only then did she allow herself to explore further. The kitchen held canned goods arranged by type, not quantity. Batteries stacked in a drawer by size. A first aid kit tucked into a cabinet that showed signs of being accessed regularly. Clean mugs hung on hooks, their handles aligned. There was water in the kettle, still warm. On the walls hung photographs, framed simply glass clean. Landscapes dominated. Mountains at different angles, rivers in seasonal flood, forests under snow and sun. Occasionally there were people, but never clearly. A shoulder turned away, a hand resting on a railing, a group shot taken from behind. Faces were cropped out or blurred by distance, as if the photographer had been careful not to capture proof of presence. The sensation crept in slowly, not as fear but as awareness. This house was not abandoned. It was waiting. She returned to the main room and stoked the fire slightly, adding a log from the neatly stacked pile beside the hearth. The flames responded eagerly, warmth spreading through the space. Her hands shook as the adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a fatigue so deep it felt structural. When she glanced toward the door, she saw the wolf. It had not entered. It stood just inside the threshold, massive body filling the space without crossing it. Snow and damp clung to its fur, but it made no move to shake itself dry. Its head turned slightly as she looked at it, eyes catching the firelight and holding her gaze. There was no challenge in its posture, no hunger, only vigilance. It remained there as she moved about the room, as if anchoring the boundary between inside and out, not guarding her from the house, guarding the house from something else. Evelyn lowered herself onto the floor near the couch, back against the wood, exhaustion finally breaking through her control. She rested her head against the edge of the seat, eyes closing for just a moment, then opening again when she realized how vulnerable that made her feel. Even here, even with warmth and walls, she could not fully relax. The pressure returned then, subtle but undeniable. Not from the forest pressing in, not from the road she had left behind, but from the structure itself. From the knowledge that she occupied this space by permission she had not been granted explicitly. Every organized shelf, every maintained tool, every carefully chosen absence of personal detail reinforced the same truth. This place belonged to someone else, someone who valued order and privacy and control. She understood, dimly, that she was tolerated because she was useful, because circumstances aligned, because something about her presence fit into a pattern she did not yet see. The house did not welcome her. It accepted her, temporarily. Her daughter stirred on the couch, murmured in her sleep, then settled again. Evelyn watched her, chest tightening with a familiar ache that had followed her since the first warning call. Protection was no longer about strength or distance. It was about choosing the least dangerous version of the unknown. The fire popped softly, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside the door, the wolf remained motionless, listening to the forest beyond the clearing, body positioned not as a guest, but as a threshold made flesh. Dawn arrived without color, a gradual thinning of the dark rather than a true sunrise. The forest lightened by degrees, shadows loosening their grip as mist clung low to the ground. Evelyn woke before her body felt ready, the habit of vigilance refusing to release her even after a few hours of shallow rest. The fire had burned down to embers, still warm enough to breathe against the cold that crept in from the edges of the house. Her daughter slept curled into the couch, wrapped tight, cheeks flushed with heat and exhaustion. The wolf was gone from the doorway. The absence registered immediately, a hollow where certainty had been. Evelyn moved quietly through the house, checking the door, the windows, the perimeter of the clearing visible through the glass. Nothing stirred. No tracks crossed the damp earth. The forest had returned to its neutral posture, as if the night had been a private arrangement now concluded. The sound of an engine reached her before she saw it. Not the erratic growl of someone lost or panicked, but a steady approach, confident and unhurried. Gravel shifted somewhere beyond the trees, tires crunching softly, then stopping with deliberate precision. Evelyn's body tightened, instincts flaring back to life. She positioned herself between her daughter and the door, one hand curling around the flashlight, the other resting flat against the wall as if the house itself might offer guidance. The pickup emerged into the clearing like it belonged there. Dark paint, recently washed. No front license plate. The vehicle settled into place beside the generator as if guided by memory rather than sight. The driver stepped out with an ease that spoke of familiarity, boots landing cleanly on the porch boards without testing their strength. He carried a lantern rather than a flashlight, its glow steady and controlled, illuminating his hands, his posture, the careful way he moved through the space. Nathan Hart looked wrong for a man arriving unannounced at a secluded house before sunrise. His clothes were practical but unmarked by travel, boots clean, gloves unscuffed. His jacket fit well, tailored enough to suggest choice rather than necessity. His face held no surprise as he took in the clearing, the house, the door now standing closed. His gaze lingered briefly on the abandoned car visible through the trees, then returned to the porch. Evelyn opened the door only after he raised both hands in a slow, deliberate gesture that communicated awareness without submission. He did not rush to fill the space with words. Instead, he set the lantern down, stepped back, and waited. When she finally allowed him inside, it was with the sense that the decision had already been accounted for. Her daughter woke at the sound of his boots crossing the threshold. Instead of fear, she showed recognition, leaning forward instinctively, eyes bright despite the unfamiliar man. The reaction unsettled Evelyn more than any threat could have. Children did not respond this way without reason. The man noticed, too, something softening briefly at the edges of his attention before control reasserted itself. He produced documents from a slim case, placing them on the table with care. Deeds, permits, maintenance records. The paper was thick, aged, stamped with seals that suggested legitimacy while avoiding clarity. Entire sections were blank where names should have been. Dates overlapped in ways that made no linear sense. It was ownership without identity, authority without attribution. Evelyn recognized the structure immediately. This was the kind of paperwork designed not to withstand scrutiny, but to discourage it. Nathan did not linger over explanations. He moved through the house instead, checking locks, reinforcing hinges, sliding additional bolts into place that had been installed for this exact purpose. He topped off the generator, tested the water, adjusted the fire with practiced efficiency. Each action implied preparation for conflict rather than comfort. This was not a caretaker's routine. It was a defensive protocol. When he opened the cabinet concealed behind the pantry wall, Evelyn stiffened. Inside were firearms, meticulously cleaned and organized, each slot accounted for. Ammunition stored dry and sealed. He removed one piece only long enough to inspect it, then replaced it with care. The wolf appeared at the threshold in that moment, silent as breath. Its presence filled the doorway, fur catching the lantern light in dull silver streaks. The air in the room shifted, pressure redistributing as if gravity itself had adjusted. Nathan froze, not in fear but in recognition. His shoulders lowered by a fraction, spine aligning into a posture that acknowledged hierarchy without overt display. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not retreat. He simply met the animal's gaze and held it. The exchange lasted seconds and carried the weight of something far older than either of them. This was not man facing beast. This was agreement being reaffirmed, terms remembered rather than negotiated. Evelyn watched closely, cataloging details. Nathan's breathing remained steady. His eyes never darted. The wolf's stance relaxed incrementally, tension bleeding away once acknowledgement was complete. Only then did the animal withdraw slightly, remaining just inside the door, watchful but no longer confrontational. The rest of the day unfolded in fragments of uneasy normalcy. Nathan brought fuel from the truck, restocked shelves from hidden compartments beneath the porch, adjusted the perimeter sensors Evelyn had not realized existed until they hummed softly back to life. He moved like someone who had rehearsed these motions long before they were needed. Evelyn's daughter played quietly on the floor, her attention drifting toward Nathan with an ease that defied logic. She followed him with her eyes, mirrored his movements unconsciously, settled when he was near. Evelyn felt the wrongness of it settle deeper into her bones. The incident on the porch happened quickly, almost insignificantly. A slip, a brief cry, a shallow cut where skin met rusted metal. Evelyn reacted instantly, scooping her daughter up, already scanning for blood. There was barely any. The scratch closed as she watched, skin knitting together with unsettling speed, leaving behind only a faint pink line that faded within minutes. Rational explanations presented themselves automatically. Shock, adrenaline, poor light. She clung to them even as her stomach tightened with dread. She cleaned the area anyway, hands trembling despite herself, and her daughter laughed as if nothing had happened. Night fell early, clouds smothering the last light. The forest pressed closer again, sounds returning in cautious increments. Evelyn lay awake on the couch, listening to the rhythm of the house, the subtle shifts of air as Nathan moved quietly from room to room. At some point, she heard the door open and close softly. She rose and watched from the window as Nathan stepped into the clearing. He did not carry a weapon or a light. He stood bareheaded beneath the trees, hands at his sides, posture relaxed yet attentive. He tilted his head upward slightly, as if listening beyond the range of human hearing. Minutes passed, then more. He remained there, still as a marker, waiting not for an answer spoken aloud, but for a response felt rather than heard. The forest did not reveal its secrets, but it did not reject him either. Evelyn understood then that Nathan Hart was not merely a relative or caretaker. He was a hinge between worlds, a man positioned where explanations failed and consequences began. Whatever had brought her to this house had been set in motion long before she turned onto that road, and the arrival of the man at dawn was not coincidence. It was confirmation. By the third night, the house no longer felt like a shelter borrowed from chance. It felt like a position taken in a conflict that had simply paused long enough for Evelyn to breathe. The air carried a different weight, not colder, not louder, but sharpened, as if the world outside had narrowed its focus, and the clearing had become a target rather than a refuge. The first sign arrived in the morning light, pale and reluctant through cloud cover. Nathan walked the perimeter with the calm efficiency of someone checking damage after a storm, but his attention lingered on the road in a way that made Evelyn's throat tighten. The gravel shoulder bore fresh marks. Tire tread patterns cut into wet dirt where no vehicle should have turned. The tracks did not belong to Nathan's pickup, which sat parked cleanly beside the generator. These were deeper, heavier, set wider apart. Whoever had driven here had not parked. They had slowed. They had looked. Then they had backed away and left as if they did not yet want to announce themselves. In the tree line, branches hung broken at shoulder height, snapped and bent with force that did not match deer or elk. There were no hoof prints, no scatter of droppings. The damage looked purposeful, as though something large had moved through without caring what it ruined, or as though someone wanted to leave a message visible to the right eyes. Evelyn tried to keep her routines intact. She fed her daughter, kept her occupied with small tasks, folded blankets, boiled water, cleaned surfaces that were already clean. The house was too orderly to accept nervous motion without making it obvious. The more she moved, the more she became aware of how the space resisted her, how everything here had been arranged by someone who did not tolerate disorder and did not invite improvisation. Nathan brought more supplies that afternoon. Not luxuries, not comfort items. Practical things that suggested an exit planned under pressure. More fuel, more batteries, sealed food, a second medical kit. He moved quickly, but his quickness was controlled, the way a man moved when he understood that haste could be heard from far away. He spoke little, and when he did, it was mostly to direct his own actions, as if words could trigger attention he did not want. He checked the locks twice. He tested the generator again. He walked to the porch and stared into the trees for long minutes, his posture rigid but restrained, like an animal that had learned to sit still while listening for danger. The wolf disappeared before dusk. Evelyn noticed because she had begun to measure time by its presence. When it was near, the forest stayed at a distance, contained behind its trunks and shadows. When it was gone, the clearing felt exposed, a bright opening in a dark map. She watched the tree line until her eyes ached, expecting its massive form to materialize again, but the woods remained stubbornly empty. Her daughter asked about it with the casual certainty children had, as if the animal were simply part of the house's routine. Evelyn answered with forced calm, swallowing the instinct to confess how much she depended on a creature she still did not understand. Night fell heavier than the nights before, clouds pressing down, the absence of moonlight turning the forest into a single mass. The house held its warmth, but warmth could not dissolve awareness. Evelyn sat awake with the lantern dimmed, listening to the fire, to the occasional soft creak of the building settling, to the dull hum of the generator outside. Every sound became suspect. Hours passed. At some point, Nathan moved through the hallway, footsteps muted, then stopped near the door as if listening. He did not open it. He did not speak. He simply waited, and the tension in the air tightened around that waiting like a rope. The wolf returned close to midnight. It did not announce itself with a howl this time. The door latch clicked softly, as if nudged from the outside with careful restraint. A shadow filled the lower window pane. Evelyn's body reacted instantly, muscles tightening, breath stopping. She rose without thinking, hand closing around the heavy object she kept within reach. When the door opened, the wolf stepped in and stopped just inside the threshold, water beating on its fur, shoulders heaving once with slow control. It did not shake itself dry. It did not circle the room. It stood still, head low, eyes bright in the dim light. The smell that followed it was faint, almost hidden beneath wet pine and earth, but it cut through Evelyn's senses like a blade. Blood. Not enough to paint the air or leave obvious stains, but enough to trigger something primitive in her body. She did not smell it the way she smelled smoke or soap. She felt it as a vibration under her skin, a warning etched into nerves. Her stomach tightened. Her scalp prickled. Fear rose in her throat without a clear image to attach to. Nathan stepped into the room behind her, saw the wolf, and his expression changed in a way Evelyn could not fully decode. Not surprise, not anger. A small shift that suggested recognition of a decision made elsewhere. He did not approach the animal. He simply nodded once, minimal and respectful, then retreated a half step as if ceding space. The wolf's gaze moved past them toward the hallway, toward the room where Evelyn's daughter slept. It did not move forward, but the direction of its attention carried a possessive gravity. Evelyn placed herself between it and the hallway instinctively, hands tight, eyes locked on its. The wolf did not challenge her. It only watched, and in its stillness she sensed calculation, patience, the kind that belonged to something accustomed to being obeyed. The wolf eventually turned its head toward the window, ears angling toward the road beyond the trees. Its body tensed for a moment, then eased. Whatever it had done outside, whatever blood it carried, it had not returned because it was finished. It had returned because it was monitoring. Nathan remained quiet until the wolf lay down near the door again, posture not relaxed but contained, like a weapon set down without being disarmed. Only then did Nathan begin preparing to leave, gathering supplies into bags as if the decision had been made for him. His movements were careful, but there was a pressure to them now, urgency hidden under discipline. Evelyn watched and felt the instinct to resist. Leaving had been her plan from the start, but now the plan felt like bait. She could sense that whatever hovered beyond the clearing wanted movement. It wanted them to run. Running would draw attention, make tracks, create mistakes. While Nathan worked, Evelyn climbed the narrow stairs to the attic in search of something she could not name. The house had begun to feel like a puzzle designed to keep her ignorant. She needed proof that her life had not been swallowed by someone else's story. The attic smelled of dry wood and dust, insulated from the warmth below. Boxes were stacked neatly, labeled in a handwriting that was not hers and not her husband's. Most contained practical items, winter gear, spare tools, canned food stored for years. Then she found the box that had no label, pushed into a corner as if forgotten deliberately. Inside were her husband's things. Not the sentimental objects she had kept in the city, not the framed photos and wedding mementos that had been packed in a hurry and left behind. These were the items of a life he had not shared. A watch with a scuffed face and a replaced strap. A private security badge, old but real, the name worn down by use. A small notebook, leather-bound, edges softened. When she opened it, she saw roots, dates, abbreviations, and place names that looked ordinary at first glance, until she noticed the pattern. Some names were written normally. Others were scrambled slightly, letters reversed, vowels missing. Coordinates appeared without context. Mileage counts were recorded with obsessive precision. There were notations about turns taken off main highways, about roads that led nowhere on official maps. And there were symbols in the margins that looked like marks, not words, as if he had written for someone who already understood the code. Evelyn's mouth went dry. Her husband had not simply hidden his past. He had hidden geography. He had concealed the shape of the world he moved through, as if certain places were safer not because they were unknown, but because they did not exist for anyone who did not know how to find them. A dull click sounded below, a shift of sound that made Evelyn freeze. She closed the notebook and descended quietly, heart pounding. The house felt different. It was still warm, still lit by the fire's low glow, but the air carried a new presence, the way a room changed when a predator stepped into it. Evelyn moved toward the living room doorway, and the sight stopped her breath. A man sat in the chair near the fireplace, as if he had always belonged there. He looked older than Nathan, but not frail. Silver threaded his hair, and his posture carried a still authority that made the house seem smaller around him. He held Evelyn's daughter in his arms, cradled against his chest with a tenderness that did not soften his presence, only sharpened its contradiction. The child was calm, not frightened, her small hand resting against his sleeve as if she had been carried like this before. Evelyn's body surged forward instinctively, protective anger rising, but she stopped herself on the edge of movement. The man's eyes lifted to her, and she understood immediately that she was not the one controlling this encounter. His gaze was steady, unblinking, and it carried no apology. He did not look like a trespasser caught in someone else's home. He looked like an owner returning to a room that had been occupied without permission. The wolf was not at the door. Evelyn's eyes snapped toward the threshold, toward the shape she expected to see, and found only empty space. Then she saw it again in the man's face. The same calm assessment, the same controlled patience. Something about the way light caught in his eyes, not reflecting like a human's should in low firelight, but glowing faintly, amber and unnervingly familiar. The realization landed slowly, each piece clicking into place with brutal inevitability. The wolf and this man were one presence wearing different forms. The animal that had guided her through the forest had not been a random creature performing an inexplicable kindness. It had been a decision, a calculated intervention, a choice made without consulting her. Nathan stood near the back of the room now, posture lowered slightly, hands visible, his silence thick with recognition. He looked smaller in the presence of the man, not physically, but in terms of space he was allowed to occupy. His deference was not theatrical. It was ingrained. The man's name, when it came, did not sound like an introduction. It sounded like a claim. Emmett Harrow. Evelyn felt the house align around that name. The fire crackled as if feeding it. The walls seemed to hold their breath. Even the floorboards fell silent, as though the building itself recognized its hierarchy. Nathan produced a bundle of old newspapers from a drawer, setting them on the table with careful hands. The papers were brittle, yellowed, edges frayed. He laid them out one by one, guiding Evelyn's attention without daring to command it. On the front pages were small articles tucked beneath larger headlines, the kind of local reporting that faded fast. A death in the mountains, an accident during a hike, an unfortunate fall, a man found too late. Her husband's name appeared in print, stripped of intimacy, reduced to a fact. Evelyn's vision tightened as she scanned the photos. Most were useless, blurry, taken from a distance. But one image caught her like a hook. A rescue scene in gray daylight, men in jackets, a stretcher, and near the edge of the frame, a close enough detail to pierce denial. Marks on fabric that did not resemble rocks or branches. Long, parallel tears that looked too clean, too deep, as if made by claws rather than accident. The kind of damage that would not be explained in the tidy language of newspapers. Evelyn's hands trembled as she looked from the papers to the man holding her daughter. The child's hair glowed softly in the firelight, her face peaceful. Emmett's grip remained gentle, but his arms held her with the certainty of someone who believed he had every right. The house had never been neutral ground. It had been a gate. And Evelyn had walked through it thinking she had chosen shelter, only to discover she had stepped into a system that recognized her daughter as something worth claiming, and recognized Evelyn as a temporary variable that could be managed. The rules were not presented as threats or bargains. They were laid out with the blunt inevitability of natural law, the way gravity existed whether one believed in it or not. Emmett did not raise his voice or soften his posture. He did not apologize. He spoke as someone who had outlived the luxury of persuasion and had learned that survival depended on clarity rather than mercy. Children born of his blood did not grow the way human children did. Their bodies learned faster than their minds. Instinct awakened before language could frame it, before empathy could temper it. Among humans, that imbalance did not produce miracles or fairy tales. It produced accidents, violence without intention, hunger mistaken for affection. He had seen it once before, long enough ago that the details had blurred but the consequences had not. He did not intend to watch it happen again. Evelyn resisted with everything she had left, not with shouting or denial, but with the raw, feral refusal of a mother whose entire nervous system rejected the idea of separation. She catalogued his statements, searched them for exaggeration, for manipulation, for some hidden agenda that could be dismantled if she found the right angle. She found none. What she found instead were confirmations she could no longer unsee. Her daughter's changes were subtle, easily dismissed by anyone who wanted to remain comfortable. A pause in mid-step, head tilting toward a sound that never reached Evelyn's ears. A sudden stillness when unfamiliar scents drifted through the clearing, nostrils flaring slightly, eyes sharpening. The way her gaze lingered on the moon through the window, not with childish curiosity, but with a quiet attentiveness that felt older than her years. The way scrapes healed too cleanly, fevers passed too quickly, fatigue burned off as if her body refused to accept limits. The most terrifying realization came not from observation, but from imagination. Evelyn pictured her daughter playing, laughing, teeth flashing in a moment of joy that tipped too far. A bite delivered without malice, without understanding. Flesh breaking. Blood. A scream that came too late. Love suddenly lethal. That thought lodged itself deep, poisoning every instinct she had relied on. Protection no longer meant holding tighter. It meant distance. It meant restraint so extreme it felt like betrayal. Nathan stood at the edge of these conversations like a man who had learned his place through loss. When he finally explained his role, it was not with pride or secrecy, but with exhaustion. He was not merely a cousin or caretaker. He was a conduit, positioned where human systems and pack systems overlapped just enough to keep each other at bay. He buried records, rerouted inquiries, bought silence, and fed misinformation into places that would otherwise dig too deeply. His life was a series of delays measured in days and weeks, not solutions. He feared Emmett, but not because Emmett was cruel. He feared him because he knew exactly what Emmett was willing to sacrifice to preserve the pack. That knowledge carried weight. It shaped obedience more effectively than violence ever could. The outside pressure escalated quickly once the house lost its invisibility. Black SUVs appeared on distant roads, idling too long at intersections, turning around without clear reason. Men watched from behind tinted glass, faces indistinct, movements precise. They did not announce themselves or demand entry. They observed. They recorded. They waited. These were not criminals chasing profit or law enforcement following procedure. They were hunters of a different kind, driven by confirmation rather than conquest. Proof mattered more than possession. A photograph, a sample, a body. Anything that could be shown to the right people in the right rooms. Evelyn understood instinctively that if they succeeded, her children would not be raised or ransomed. They would be dissected into explanations. She stood between two predatory systems, each convinced of its own necessity. One wanted her children as heirs, as future anchors of continuity. The other wanted them as evidence, as leverage against the unknown. Neither saw her as central. She was a variable, an obstacle to be managed. The breaking point did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, late at night, when Evelyn watched her daughter sleep and realized that her strength had never been in holding on. It had always been in choosing how to let go without abandoning herself. She began to think in terms of presence rather than possession, in proximity rather than control. The pack did not require her absence to function. It required structure, distance, rules that acknowledged biology without erasing bond. The compromise she shaped was brutal in its precision. The children would live within the pack's territory, where their instincts could unfold without turning lethal. They would be raised among those who could teach them restraint before power, and she would remain near enough to matter, close enough to be known, but constrained by boundaries that limited touch, scent, and proximity when necessary. No impulsive embraces, no unguarded play, love expressed through vigilance rather than closeness. It was not exile. It was not surrender. It was a redefinition of motherhood under conditions that did not care about fairness. When she presented this choice, Emmett studied her for a long time, not as a negotiator weighing concessions, but as a survivor recognizing another. He saw the absence of illusion in her reasoning, the way she did not pretend the compromise was just or kind. She understood the cost and accepted it anyway. That, to him, was not weakness. It was alignment with reality. He agreed not because she convinced him, but because she proved she would not lie to herself for comfort. The pack would accommodate her presence within limits that preserved safety. Those limits would be enforced without exception, even when they hurt. Nathan accepted the outcome with visible relief and unspoken grief. He had seen too many variations of this story end in blood. This version, though painful, offered continuity. The black vehicles lingered for a while longer, testing boundaries, probing for cracks. Each time they approached too closely, something shifted in the forest. Paths vanished. Signals failed. One SUV returned with its windows shattered from the inside, occupants shaken and silent, unwilling or unable to explain what had happened beyond a sudden sense of being watched too closely. Eventually, the hunters withdrew, not defeated but deferred. The legend remained unconfirmed, unresolved. That uncertainty would buy time. Evelyn moved into a small structure at the edge of the territory, close enough to see her children daily, far enough to keep them safe from her. Each separation cut fresh, but each reunion, bounded and controlled, reaffirmed her choice. Her children grew stronger, faster, eyes bright with a clarity that frightened and awed her in equal measure. She learned to measure love in patience rather than touch, in presence rather than possession. And though every instinct in her rebelled against the shape her motherhood had taken, she understood that survival was not about preserving what felt natural. It was about adapting without losing the core of who she was. In that understanding, she remained. Time passed the way it did in places that tried to stay off maps, not measured by calendars, but by weather fronts, by the thickness of pine needles underfoot, by the slow migration of light across the same ridge line each morning. Winter softened into a damp, gray spring, and spring sharpened into a short, bright summer that smelled of sap and sun-warmed bark. Through it all, Evelyn lived in a small house at the edge of the territory, positioned like a sentry post rather than a home. It was close enough that she could see the main lodge through the trees when the air was clear, close enough that her children's laughter sometimes reached her porch like a thin ribbon of sound. It was far enough that she could survive. The distance was never symbolic. It was physics. The children grew quickly, not only in height and coordination, but in presence. Their bodies carried a density that did not belong to human childhood, a contained energy that made the air feel charged when they ran. Their senses sharpened day by day. Their movements became quieter, more precise. They learned to listen to silence as if it contained information. They learned to taste the wind. They learned to stop mid-laugh and stare toward the tree line, attention snapping to something that Evelyn could not see. Their joy was real. It was also dangerous. Evelyn learned the rules of proximity like prayers. She greeted them from a safe distance when they were excited or hungry. She waited for the moments when they were calm, when their breathing was slow, when their eyes held more mind than instinct. She never let them climb onto her lap the way children naturally tried to. She never let their mouths get close to her skin, even in play. She learned to live with the ache of wanting to pull them tight, and being forced instead to hold her hands in her pockets, fingers curled hard enough to bruise. She became fluent in small rituals that replaced touch, the same wave every morning, the same way she bent to meet their eyes without letting her throat come within reach, the same soft gestures that communicated love without risk. She learned to read their disappointment and not collapse under it. She learned to smile through it, to make herself steady, to make the boundaries feel like structure instead of rejection. Some nights she sat on her porch and listened to the forest breathe. The territory had its own rhythm, patrols that passed beyond the range of her sight, distant howls that were not calls into emptiness, but signals exchanged between minds shaped by pack logic. The land felt inhabited by an invisible architecture of rules, lines drawn and respected by those who could sense them. Emmett remained at the center of that architecture, even when he was not visible. His authority was not performed. It was embedded. The pack moved around his decisions the way water moved around stone, shaping itself to what could not be shifted. At first, his presence had been something Evelyn endured. He was the reason her life had broken into before and after. He was the weight behind every boundary. He had been the wolf that decided for her, the man who claimed without asking. Yet as months turned into a year, she began to notice changes in him that were almost imperceptible, like cracks forming in ice. He still wore control the way he wore clothing, but it loosened at the edges when the children were near. His gaze softened in the brief moments when they stumbled, when they looked to him for guidance, when they leaned into his legs without fear. He did not show affection as humans did. He did not kneel down and coo. He corrected with touch that was firm and deliberate. He allowed closeness when it served stability. But the devotion was undeniable, carved into the way he watched them, as if the world could not be trusted to hold them without his attention. In those moments, Evelyn saw something else, too. A grief that did not shout but sat under everything like sediment. The loss of a son, the loss of years, the loss of choices that had been made too late to undo. Emmett had been raised in a system where love and control were nearly the same thing, where protection meant possession. He had believed his decisions were necessary. Time had not proven him wrong. It had only shown him what necessity cost. One late autumn evening, when the air smelled of distant snow and the sky held that hard clarity that came before winter, Evelyn saw him standing alone near the edge of the clearing. The children were inside, the pack quiet. He looked older than he had the night he first appeared in her life, not in body but in the posture of his shoulders, the weight in his stillness. He watched her house for a long time without moving. Evelyn did not approach. She simply remained on her porch, letting the distance between them speak the truth neither of them could soften. A man like Emmett did not come to the edge of his own territory without a reason. After that night, subtle shifts began. Nathan visited Evelyn more often, bringing supplies and information she did not ask for. His eyes carried a restless urgency, a caution that did not fit the season. He spoke in half-statements and careful silences, as if the wrong word might become an invitation. Evelyn felt a slow dread building, not because something threatened the territory directly, but because something inside the system was moving toward change. Change was the most dangerous thing in a structure built on control. Emmett did not address her about it. He continued the routines. He continued the boundaries. He continued to test the children's discipline and to enforce calm when instinct flared. But Evelyn began to see him watching her differently, not as a human liability to be managed, as a wound that refused to close. He understood at last what his old certainty had ignored. He had saved her on the road not only because the children mattered. He had saved her because she was the last link to what he had failed to protect in his son. In keeping her alive, he had been trying to redeem a loss he could not admit to himself. There were things the pack did not discuss aloud. There were rules older than speech, but there were also loopholes, pressure points in the world's design that could be exploited by those who knew where to push. Emmett knew them. He had been alpha too long not to. Deep in the forest, beyond the patrol lines and beyond the natural reluctance of most wolves to venture into certain valleys, there was a place the land itself seemed to avoid. A hollow where trees grew crooked and sparse, where moss formed in unnatural patterns, where birds did not nest. It was not cursed in a theatrical way. It was simply wrong, as if the rules of nature had been rewritten there by something older than the forest. Something lived at the edge of that wrongness. Not a spirit in the folkloric sense, not a demon with horns, not a creature that required belief to exist. It was older than oaths, older than paperwork, older than the idea that humans could own land. It existed as function rather than form. It granted wishes in the way storms granted rain. It did not care who deserved what. It cared only about balance. It took payment in what made identity possible. Emmett sought it without telling the pack, not even Nathan. This was not a decision that could survive debate. It was a choice that had to be made in isolation, because if he allowed anyone else to weigh in, he would be forced back into the comfort of hierarchy and tradition. He had lived his entire life inside those comforts. They had killed his son all the same. He wanted the impossible, not simply for Evelyn to be safe, not simply for the children to have a human mother present in their lives. He wanted the distance to end. He wanted the family to stop being a system of surveillance and restraint. He wanted Evelyn to be able to hold her children when they ran toward her without fear, turning their love into a weapon. To make that possible, the rules of biology had to change. The border between human and wolf had to become permeable again in a way it had not been for centuries. He understood the cost, even before he offered it. When the wish was made, it did not manifest as lightning or spectacle. It manifested as absence, a quiet, almost gentle removal of something essential. The price was precise, surgical, memory, name, the authority that lived not in muscle but in the continuity of a self that remembered who it was. Emmett traded the core of his identity, the structure that held his leadership together. He traded the internal map of his life, all the reasons and histories that made him alpha. He paid with the part of himself that could claim. The change reached Evelyn like a tide she could not outrun. One evening she felt the air shift, pressure dropping, as if a storm had passed overhead without clouds. Her skin prickled. Her hearing sharpened abruptly, the crackle of the fire becoming a complex language. Her sense of smell flooded with detail: wood smoke, damp wool, the mineral tang of stone. Her heart raced, then steadied into a rhythm that felt deeper than blood. Pain came, but it was not the clean pain of injury. It was the pain of transformation, of nerves learning new pathways. Heat rose under her skin as if her body were burning away one structure to rebuild another. Her bones ached with a deep, internal pressure, as though something inside her was rearranging itself to accommodate a truth it had previously rejected. She did not lose consciousness. She remained trapped inside the process, forced to experience every second of becoming. When it ended, the world felt sharper and more alive. The house smelled like a living thing. The wind carried messages. The distance to the lodge was no longer measured only in steps, but in scent trails and faint vibrations in the earth. Evelyn's body felt stronger, denser, less fragile. She stepped outside in the cold and did not shiver. For the first time, she could imagine holding her children without death hovering in the space between skin and teeth. She found them at the edge of the clearing, instinct pulling her there. They ran toward her as they always did, bright and fast. This time she did not hold herself back. She lowered her arms and let them collide with her, let their bodies press into hers, let their faces bury into her coat. Their teeth grazed her collarbone in playful closeness, and her blood did not scream in panic. Her senses registered the contact, the heat, the wild energy, and instead of fear, she felt alignment. The joy that rose in her was so sudden it nearly broke her. It was the simple, devastating relief of touch restored. Only when she lifted her head did she see what had been sacrificed. Emmett sat on the porch steps of the main lodge, wrapped in a heavy coat as if he were older than he had any right to be. His posture was relaxed in a way she had never seen before, not from peace, but from emptiness. His eyes followed the children with a soft focus, like a man watching something familiar without remembering why it mattered. The pack moved around him carefully, voices low, footsteps cautious. Nathan stood nearby with a rigidity that suggested shock. The hierarchy had not vanished. It had simply lost its anchor. Emmett smiled when the children approached him. He reached down and stroked their hair with hands that remembered the motion, even when the mind behind it was gone. He looked up at Evelyn as if seeing her for the first time, an expression of faint recognition flickering and failing to land. He was alive but hollow. No longer the alpha in human skin, no longer the king of the territory, no longer the judge whose words shaped everyone's fate. He was simply an old man on a porch who knew only that the sight of wolf children playing in the clearing felt right. Evelyn watched him with a pain that had no clean outlet. The family had been saved. The distance had been erased. Her children could have their mother fully. But the foundation that had held the system together had paid with itself. In this new order, where she could finally be near without fear, happiness carried a shadow that would never fully lift. Love had not taken a body. It had taken a name. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.